Welcome to another video from the Vickers MG Collection and Research Association. This one's being made on the eve of Victory over Japan Day, so 15th of August, and the 75th anniversary of that being 2020, looking back to 1945. So in this video, I want to touch on how the Vickers machine gun was being used in the Far East throughout the war. Some of it will be weighted towards the end of the war, and certainly the mannequins that we've got made up in the collection here in Swindon are representative of 1945 soldiers from the UK and from Australia. So we do have that bias towards the end of the war, but we'll try and touch on the developments earlier on as well. So how was the Vickers being used in the Far East? Lots of different countries were using it. And the Vickers machine gun of British manufacture was still being used by the British, the Indians, and the Australians, New Zealanders. There were earlier organisations like the Singapore Volunteer Defence Corps, the Volunteer Corps, the Hong Kong Local Defence Forces were using the Vickers as well. And pretty much anybody that had been equipped through the British Empire had the Vickers as part of their establishment. And what had also happened in the Far East, and we'll talk about it in another video, is the Australians had actually been producing their own Vickers machine guns, and these were being used to arm the Australians and New Zealanders and any of the supply lines that were coming from that part of the world. So plenty of Vickers machine guns to go around. It was being used slightly differently to how we were talking about it in our previous video on Operation Overlord in Northwest Europe. Not only have you got all these different countries using it, and the Canadians as well earlier in the campaigns, but it was being used not only en masse with the divisional machine gun battalions, and the one that's there and dominant at the latter part of the war is the 2nd Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, but the Middlesex Regiment had units that had been captured en masse at the start of the war as well. So divisional machine gun battalions were present within the theatre, and the Australians also had their divisional machine gun battalions as well, the 2nd 1st, 2nd 2nd, 2nd 3rd, the 6th, and others as well I'm sure that I'm missing. But there were those sort of traditional divisional machine gun battalions, of which the Indians had their own as well. But alongside those, you had the machine gun platoons that were still present in many of the infantry battalions as well. So you'd have 4 guns as part of the infantry battalion, mainly for direct fire tasks. Certainly throughout the British and Indian Army, that seems to have been retained, possibly reflecting how those battalions were being used a little bit more independently, or their doctrine was slightly different. The Australian militia battalion seems to have retained that. And some of the Australian Imperial Force, Australian Military Force, some of those battalions seem to have retained it as well. So lots more Vickers machine guns available in the infantry division. What's also really important to recognise is that the New Zealanders had their machine guns in the same fashion. I'm not 100% sure that they had the divisional machine gun battalions in the Pacific. Certainly they did in the 2nd New Zealand Division in Italy, which we'll cover another time as well. But the Vickers machine guns throughout the infantry division. And then we have to consider the special units. The Chindits particularly is possibly one of the most well known from the Far East, being one of those special organisations, special brigade. And they had their Vickers machine guns in the columns. So what that actually means is where a column is being made up of Royal Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery, being used as infantry in those columns, actually those units were being armed with Vickers machine guns as well. I think they borrowed machine gunners from from infantry units, but I'm not 100% sure, but it's quite possible that you'd have seen Royal Artillery and Royal Tank Regiment got badged Vickers machine gunners. And we mustn't forget that Victory over Japan actually, the adversary in that was Japan, and they extensively used the Vickers machine gun. They were producing under license in the 1930s from Vickers Armstrongs. They produced their own types of Vickers machine gun, both for the Army and for the Air Force. Japanese Zeros were a adaptation of the Type E Vickers machine gun as their machine gun armament. So you do start to see captured Japanese Vickers machine guns as well. Other countries in the area, Netherlands, East Indies, and we've talked about that in one of our commercial guns is a gun supplied to the Netherlands, East Indies. So we've got lots of sort of things to be able to talk about, and all I can do in this video really is broadly cover some of those main aspects, some of those things that jump out at me from the literature, from the photos available. So many of the photos that you'll see are sourced from the Australian War Memorial, which probably has the best digital collection online of all of their archives and photographic material in the world. Some photos are from the online collection of the Imperial War Museum as well, and others I've sourced from various places. I'll try and identify all those sources in the description to the video. It's too complex to put captions on this simple thing, but I'll try and make sure that you can trace all of that material. And of course, I'll try and put links in there to the website, the Vickers Machine Gun website, where you can try and find out more as well. So that's sort of a round-robin introduction to how the Vickers was being used in the Far East, and I'll try and talk a bit more about detail of the specific kit that was being used, any potential interesting actions that talk about it. I've talked about the organisation, but then you've got your different individual units, because the Far East was at the end of the British supply lines. So you see the Mark 6 tank being used for a little bit longer. You see the Australian-made Matildas in service as well, Australian-used Matildas in service right up until the end of the war there. Those didn't switch over to Brownings until much later, and you've got even use on boats, amphibious craft, even, and I'll put the photo up, being used on the sort of US Marine style Amtraks, those landing craft vehicles, and the Royal Air Force were obviously using the Vickers K gun on their aircraft for observers and for defensive armament. They were the Vickers appeared in armoured cars, certainly much earlier, and in Malaya we've got some of those armoured car pictures from the late 30s, early 1940s, that show the Vickers in all of its uses, much more than just than we see in Northwest Europe. So I'll try and cover as much as that as possible. More detail, might be some fly-off videos, but let's see what detail we can get in. Let's start by looking at some of the photos that we've got available. So a Vickers machine gun, 27th October 1941, in use with men of the Manchester Regiment in Malaya, really early on, showing their pith helmets, their khaki drill uniforms, clearly on exercise. How do we know that? Well, it's got a blank firing adapter, a blank firing attachment in the muzzle attachment there, and you can just see it coming out of the half cone blast deflector. So a really early example of the Vickers in use, or really early sort of training in Malaya in 1941. Quite a classic photo, very interesting to see. You can see the green diamonds on the side of the puggree of the pith helmet that seems to indicate that it was Manchester Regiment unit. We then have this photo that seems to be from a series of the Malay Regiment, and I can only assume these are those guys as well. Number 8 belt boxes in use here, still probably around 1941, I think. From other photos in the series, they seem to be dated there, but clearly showing that wider sort of British Empire use of the Vickers with these Malay Regiment troops. Now, these men of the 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders have dismounted their Vickers machine gun from their Lanchester 6-wheeled armoured car and are using it it's a Mark IV, I believe, a Vickers machine gun, and are actually using it with the bipod. They've got their number 10, the white belt boxes next to it, and are operating on the roads in Malaya. So 1941 again, interesting to see this sort of transition from wheeled armoured cars in use still, considered a mobile war, and later they're very much obsolete once you have to actually fight in the jungle, not just on the roads around the jungle. We fired from the bipod using a Mark I gun, so we didn't have pistol grip and shoulder stock, but it was quite interesting to do. It is remarkably much more stable than we expected it to be. I think in this case it's actually a left-hand feed block gun as well, out of the turret, so that's why you've got the number 2 on the left-hand side of the gun there. Now, I can't recall the source of this particular picture, but I believe they are West African troops, and those West African divisions actually came across and fought in the Far East as part of the British Empire, and clearly can't be forgotten. They're another of those mix of nations that are serving in this region, serving in this theatre, and a really important part of it. So they were all armed with Vickers machine guns. It was sort of almost a commonality between all of the forces that were fighting there. But these West African division troops, quite interesting to see them operating alongside everybody else. As far as the gun goes, this is actually quite interesting to see a sort of full length but without strap water jacket barrel casing cover on this one. Something not really sure where that falls. I think it might be a locally made item. Normally a British water jacket cover would be 2/3 long, an Australian one would be this full length but have a strap round the middle, and really only seen on Australian guns much later. So interesting sort of accessory with that, with the additional label that is 1943. Doesn't show any Vickers machine guns particularly. However, I think the large case on the shoulder of the individual stood waiting to cross is actually one of the rangefinders in its case, which we've done a separate video on. So I thought I'd just draw this out to potentially look at how the rangefinders were still being carried. It may not be, but it certainly matches the description of that. And you can see there as well that pack saddlery is clearly being used so much to carry the heavy equipment and the supplies that aren't able to be carried by the men. So those mules are undergoing, they're carrying so much weight. We've done a video on the pack saddlery as well, and it's just absolutely huge amounts of weight that those animals are expected to carry. Now, this photo is quite commonly seen, and the Imperial War Museum caption for it says that it is a soldier of the 2nd Battalion East Lancashire Regiment firing a Vickers machine gun at Nguyengon in December 1944. Whereas Rex King Clark, in his book, he was the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, the Manchester Regiment, he identifies it as Private H. Bowers, who was killed in action with 2nd Manchesters. Now, checking the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they say that Private Harry Bowers was killed aged 25 on 17 November 1944 and is buried in Taoyuan War Cemetery in Myanmar, so Burma. Whoever it is in the photo, clearly Private Harry Bowers was killed, and hopefully this is a lasting memory of him, but I think it's one of those that we'll never know. What the photo does show, though, is the use of pistol order equipment, because he's carrying that much more. It's not something, again, we see in Northwest Europe too often, how pistol orders being used with Vickers machine gun crews, but it also looks like he's got the dial sight case around his body. That strap going from his right shoulder down to his left side, possibly indicating no use. But he's clearly firing in action here. The belt is empty on the left and full on the right. We can't see a number 2 here, but assume one is there. As we leap forward to 1945, you see the Australians use their Vickers twin mounts like this on their boats, using the number 10 belt box designed originally for armoured fighting vehicles. But you can see here that's what they were using on board these craft. Quite interesting. But also then on their, I understand US supplied Amtrak vehicles, 2 mounted at the front here with their sandbag emplacement. We'll discuss Australian ingenuity in a completely separate video, but rather than walking, as you see here, they actually started to use jeeps to move those guns around. This is one of the packing photos of that, but also trying to look at lighter ways of using the Vickers. And this Bren tripod has been adapted. The trials report says it's not stable enough, but clearly was an idea of how to improve the Vickers in the jungle. But you can see from these emplacements where they're having to dig in, avoiding Japanese mortars, and generally looking after their guns, naming them in the jungle. As a brief side-by-side overview of the Australian on the left and the British soldiers on the right, the British soldier represents quite a transition, sort of a mishmash of kit, in that we've got dyed khaki drill shirt and trousers, dyed jungle green, some dyed webbing, but also some jungle green produced webbing, British and Indian, and the British items with the black, the Indian items with black metal accoutrements there, but then dyed British pouches, British made net with an Indian helmet net, and just standard sort of hobnail boots. Whereas, and you can see that these have already started to fade the jungle green dye out, but they're wearing puttees as well. So whereas with the Australian, you have jungle boots, quite specific and bespoke. They're using US but cut down US type gaiters, and in this case I've got them the mannequin wearing US herringbone twill uniform and a US applied life vest. What the Australians did do was produce their own jungle green beret cap there, but then this 37 pattern webbing, wider shoulder straps to disperse the load more, and larger, and we will discuss these very specifically because they did some amazing stuff with their webbing with the Vickers. Larger basic pouches, you can see the sort of side-by-side comparison there, much more capacity in the Australian made as opposed to the British. Shortened bayonet, not necessarily consistent, but was there. Hip mounted or belt mounted water bottle, so it wasn't hanging down. And then just to walk around and see, we've got the British type or Indian type sort of machete there, whereas the Australian is an American type, really, in an Australian scabbard, much longer, much more suited to the jungle environment. So the developments you saw just there with the with the Bren gun tripod, much more sort of thinking about how they were going to fight and operate in the jungle using bespoke equipment rather than adaptations of the equipment already in service. And that's something they did for their machine guns as well. So you can see here the lamp, which we've covered separately, fitted, the water jacket cover that I talked about, the long with the loops, that's for rifle slings. We'll demonstrate that more. You can see in the back there past this label, a canvas bag that they were using for spare parts. It's actually an adaptation of a Lewis gun bag. You've got these shorter, stubbier ammunition liners that we've talked about in our ammunition box video as well, and that web arrangement is something that came along quite later, for carrying the 2-gallon can. So quite different equipment was being used by the Australians rather than the sort of just pushing through with the standard equipment, which seems to be much more likely in the British arrangements. So yeah, sort of much more ingenuity about how they were going to operate and fight. So what haven't I talked about? I've mentioned pack saddlery. Clearly mules were in use with the Chindit forces. I've mentioned the Australians and their use of the jeeps. Clearly Shanks's pony, the infanteer, was the boots on the ground kind of moving the Vickers man carrying the Vickers, long carries was order of the day. Universal carrier doesn't seem to be as widely used for machine gun use in the Far East. By the end of the war, second Manchesters were using US supplied Dodge weapons carriers as opposed to 1500 weight trucks. 1500 weight trucks were being used beforehand, but say not the universal use of the universal carrier in the same way. I haven't mentioned, probably because I'll save it for another video specifically, but the Indian Army were using the Vickers Berthier in the early part before Bren's came available. They were using that in the light machine gun role. The Vickers the Vickers Berthier made in Ishapur. They were able to do their own supply lines and things like that. Vickers Berthier we'll cover completely separately at some point. And what I will go on and talk about is some intelligence reports, the medium machine guns in the jungle. Actually, how were we using these things? Indirect, direct fire. What was the state of play? So I'll go through that sort of doctrine and how was that being used to finish off after hopefully another informative video. If you have enjoyed the video, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. It's now available in euros, dollars, euros and pounds as well as dollars. So local currency payments, which is great. We're putting loads more archive material on there. It does support these videos. You'll hopefully see more of the firing videos that we've linked in as well. They clearly cost money, so please go online and support us where we can. Even if it's the case if you want something in return for that more than just the benefits of Patreon. These t-shirts are available through Teespring. We've got some merchandise and sales on our own website as well, so please take a look at that. And what you should see in the bottom corner of your screen now is a logo. Please click on that and make sure you subscribe to these videos. Thank you for watching. I'll now talk about the doctrine of how medium machine guns were viewed in the jungle. Now, I talked about the MMG being part of the infantry battalions, and it clearly wasn't always the case, as this report shows. From number 1 Indian Operational Research Section, it investigates reintroducing the Vickers MMG into the infantry battalions and how it should be used and why. So there's a lot of sort of background information as to the views of it. And how the Japanese viewed the medium machine gun, used them liberally. But this report talks about different opportunities for using the Vickers because of its main characteristics, being long fields of fire, 1,500 yards or more, long horizontal beaten zone, 1,000 yards by 300 yards for the beaten zone there. It decreases a fair amount depending on the range, but they see value for it being used and its long flat trajectory being valuable for that. So this report talks about how it would be used in flat jungle country merely as a sort of beneficial role like the light machine gun, just for longer reach, perhaps at 2,500 yards, in mountain jungle with direct fire. You're seeing the Japanese on other slopes across valleys and things like that. And then in defence in flat jungle country, clearly you can set down crossfire defensive positions, enfilade fire, fixed lines as well with the MMG. But what it does talk about is actually don't bother using the Mark 8Z ammunition, the special ammunition. That gives its range of 4,000 yards plus, but really infrequently in the jungle, and you'd want to use the Mark 7, and then you've got compatibility across all of your different weapons. There was a problem considered with how you would train men. Would you draw them out of the infantry battalion for machine gunners? You don't want to deplete your infantry companies, but actually at the moment there was it says there still exists a fair number of senior NCOs and Viscount commissioned officers with medium machine gun experience who could form a nucleus of instructors, and you'd be able to train people up quite quickly, possibly from the anti-aircraft platoons and their gun sections that were now disbanded, so from the light infantry battalions. So real sort of interesting report on how you would use them, and it considers that actually you would include them perhaps in two forms depending on the type of battalion, and a war establishment is provided for a brigade machine gun company, similar I suppose to the brigade support companies that existed in Northwest Europe, but on a mule pack basis or a jeep basis. And you're looking at total establishment of personnel for the mule company being 126 all ranks with 51 mules. Personnel of the jeep company would be 118, so slightly less. No muleteers needed, mule handlers, but 31 jeeps and 18 trailers. So you've actually got quite a substantial company there that they were proposing to draw together. This seems not to have happened. It seems to have been retained either in the machine gun battalions, and possibly those companies of that battalion being broken up and supporting the individual brigades. But always happy to be corrected on this. Did this ever happen? It's a really interesting report that you can see how they were actively thinking of the doctrine to use what by now was already a 30-year-old weapon, 32-year-old. This is March 1944, and how it would be used in these latter campaigns of the Far East. So, we know how it ends up in 44, 45, but in hindsight, this is quite an interesting report to draw out of the archives. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do, as always, comment, let us know what you want more of, ask questions, and we'll try to answer them as much as possible. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and share the video and subscribe to the channel. Please support us on Patreon if you're able to, and let us know of anything you'd like to see in the future. I look forward to hearing from you.